its job of spreading the oil inside the furnace. That noise could always be heard during the day. And that went on for several years. I worked seasonally with that uncle, and I was in charge of bringing in the oil in boats from the gas station about 2 blocks from the house. Then, using a long handle to maneuver safely from a distance, 2 of that uncle's sons would carefully pour the metal into molds made of earth. Little by little, they would guide the crucible of molten metal or iron and fill the molds with earth through the holes where it penetrated. When I finished casting the pieces, I had to use a shovel to gather the earth, breaking up the clumps of earth that had hardened due to the heat, which required a lot of strength. And once it was granulated again, it had to be shoveled to gather it all against the side wall, so that it would be ready for when my older cousins turned it into molds again. I worked in this foundry, seasonally, from the age of 9 to 15. That was around the time my cousins removed the foundry workshop, except that during that time I also had to fulfill the tasks my father gave me, the most terrifying of which, given my age, was to rope certain round irons with a so-called saw, and then cut them with a bow and hacksaw, into sections of about 20 centimeters each. And all of this generally left my hands blistered or bleeding. And this was a periodic job that lasted about 15 years, but, as if this were not enough, there were household duties, mainly in the mornings, when it was my duty and that of my slightly younger brother to carry water, since there were no water cisterns installed in the houses at that time. At that time, in Etsahualcoyotl, we had to go to the corners, where the public fountains were, and there, everyone would line up their buckets for more than 2 hours, until they could get a little water. A few years later, we only had to carry it from the gate to the property to a large vat. It wasn't impossible, but it's not as hard to imagine, when it becomes a situation that can last for more than 15 years. To conclude this matter, I want to say that the abrupt change in my childhood occurred when I was around 8 years old. Because my father couldn't pay the rent to my paternal grandmother for the small room and kitchen where we lived, she evicted him. Fortunately, for that reason, my maternal grandmother didn't want to leave us on the street, and offered us her house, located in the municipality called Netsahualcoyotl, and we went to Americo Living Trail 3030. Lived there. Even though most of the land in that area was vacant, my grandmother's house was quite poor, with roofs covered with sheets of cardboard and tar, which, with the persistent sun and the changing weather, suffered tears. So when it rained, water seeped in, and things had to be moved each time. Also, when the rains were heavier, and we came home from work or school, we had to walk practically, splashing through the mud. So, if there had been a torrential flood, we would arrive home almost knee-deep in mud, since there weren't even ground-level drainage channels yet. Fortunately, there was a bathroom with its own septic tank in the middle of the property, awkwardly perched but useful. But my father, despite being very poor, always defended his independence as a self-employed employee. Although he never actually earned enough money to support a family of any size, like ours. This is why I only studied up to the university level. However, I read a lot on my own, and was more interested in esoteric subjects than in philosophical ones. I managed to enter the Autonomous University of Mexico, but my father's precarious health and lack of financial resources made it difficult for me to continue my studies, and from the age of 16, for longer or shorter periods, I took care of the family expenses in my father's small business. My brothers helped me and also took care of the family periodically. But being the oldest, I felt the demands and responsibility more strongly. As I have suggested before, my father actually spent about 20 years of his life visiting the hospital at regular times. My relationship with him wasn't easy, but in addition to what I've already described, from the age of 6, he took me running every Sunday before dawn, a few kilometers in Chapultepec or the Deportiva. So by the age of 11, I was already doing an exercise routine every other day. I remember well the reasons why I began this religious task of exercising 3 or 4 times a week. When I was 11, my great-aunt passed away, and as I was on the verge of fainting at the wake, my father gave me a serious scolding, telling me it was because I was a skinny little thing and all, because I didn't exercise like him. So, around age 11, after he called me out for being a wimp, I started doing an exercise routine with a few weights. I didn't fail every other day. Until I graduated from high school, I lost the sense or reason for doing that routine. That's why I gained a little weight, which I would start losing when, at age 19, I learned the yoga routine. But the main reason I really decided to lose weight wasn't primarily because of my love for yoga, but because of one of the students, with whom I fell in love, as teenagers often do. So after this love at first sight, I had my body back in shape within 6 months. My way of life always presented me with periods where my subsistence as a worker became more intense, sometimes pushing me to the limits of my strength. For example, I was around 13 years old when my father partnered with a person who repaired vehicle clutches and brakes, and my father sent me as his representative to work there. It was a job that involved contact with automobile grease, and several times a day I had to walk along Americo Living Trail 31 streets next to what I believe was a cemetery, all to take car drums and other special parts to be reworked. This went on for about 4 months, after having experienced several sleepless nights trying to finish difficult or urgent jobs, until my father decided to end the partnership, to defend me from an altercation with his partner, but also because this was a very unstable partnership. Contact with the masters of the Great Universal Brotherhood. As part of my self-taught cultural quest, one day I bought the book The Great Messages by Sir Renaud de la Ferrière. This special book impacted my life, and I would never be the same again. It consisted of 6 messages related to the advent of the New Age. Later, I bought the book by the same author, Yogism, referring to the 7th message. It was 1979, and I was about to turn 19 when, driving my father's battered pickup truck, we were headed to the small business in the working-class neighborhood. This time, the tension that filled me was caused by trying to control this wreck across the busy Zaragoza highway. At the same time, I was always eager to learn how to drive it, as I'd never had the opportunity to take a driver's license, and since I was 16, I'd taken on this challenge solely out of necessity. We were looking for a gas station, as this old truck needed more gas than usual. So we left the road, and continued straight ahead, along Zaragoza Avenue, until we reached Airport Boulevard, and then, surprise! Here, the big letters that read, GFU Yoga popped out. For some time now, I had hoped to find some yoga center or something like that, where they put into practice the teachings of Drive de la Ferrière, according to the 7 great messages, that I had read with such special enthusiasm. So a few days later I found myself here ready to sign up. What I admired most about the Frenchman, named Sir Renaud de la Ferrière, was not only that he had more than 5 university degrees, but also that his disciples recognized him as a scientific Christ, and I wanted to see for myself. So, shortly after discovering this yoga center, I went to visit it. But since there was no one at the reception desk, and I discovered a staircase, I decided to go up there. I reached the top of the 2nd floor, and found the pleasant space with a pleasant smell of incense that inspired peace. The place was carpeted in red, and I was pleasantly impressed by the photo of the Master La Ferrière standing out in the space and the 12 wooden signs of the zodiac harmoniously arranged on the walls that formed the space. I remained in this magical corner, lost in the city. I waited a few minutes, but no one arrived. Americo Living Trail 32. In any case, I left happy, because I knew that a new stage of my life was beginning. That same week, I signed up and immediately began practicing the routine of yoga postures called asanas. A few days later, I was delighted to discover that there was also a small weight room here. From then on, I tried to combine weight training with yoga, giving greater importance to the latter, because I already knew that the goal of Hatha Yoga is to achieve proper balance of the endocrine glands, and not just simple and strange body contortions. I never thought about becoming a vegetarian, even though my Dr. La Ferrière recommended it as an important step in my life. Time passed, and I tried being a vegetarian for 6 months. I was succeeding, but on a trip to Guadalajara, visiting my uncle, with whom I wanted to live, I started eating meat again. I want to mention that uncle from Guadalajara, my father's brother. He was around 30 at the time, when my father was already a few years older. But that person was an important support when I was 15, because there were times when my father drank a lot and argued with my mother, involving us, as children, in his marital problems. Then my uncle defended us. And in his desire to support my older sister and me, he paid for 2 important courses for us, given our tender age. One was a short one-year degree to become an executive secretary. We learned shorthand, spelling, and how to use the old, heavy typewriters at the prestigious Remington Institute, located in downtown Mexico City. The other was a mind control course at the then nascent Silva Mind Control. Both courses helped me as much as the English courses my father used to sporadically enroll me in his eagerness for me to learn English. And, by the way, I had already learned to read by the age of 5, being able to babble entire paragraphs from magazines about characters like Shannock and the Lone Ranger. And then, he was able to read me 2 classics, Tom Sawyer and The Count of Monte Cristo. Luckily, my paternal aunt was young and already knew English, so she made me read short stories in English. Still, I never practiced English enough. My situation in that area was serious. In addition, however, I fondly remember my father having me memorize emblematic and well-known poems, so I could recite them aloud. Mainly because I was a bit of a stutterer as a child, and with this discipline and the fear of my father, so he wouldn't hit me with his belt, he would correct me. But I want to add to this, that my father was very fond of cinema, and took me to see religious films like The Ten Commandments, Quo Vadis, Ben-Hur, and many others, that dealt with Greek mythology, such as The Labors of Hercules, Jason and the Argonauts, and others, which were the ones I liked the most. Anyway, regarding my uncle, when I went to visit him, hoping he would help me change my destiny, and get away from so many limitations with my own family, I was perhaps about 20 years old. I was already familiar with the GFU, Great Universal Fraternity, and the Solar Line. But I wanted to, since he already had a job as a bureaucrat in the administration department, having earned a degree in administration. However, times weren't right for him to be able to support me. He already had 2 very young daughters, and another had recently passed away. And their mother was a young woman almost twice his age. Because of all this, things weren't going well in my uncle's life, as you can easily guess. And when I arrived, they were in the process of filing for a marital separation. Americo Living Trail 33. But he was kind during the month he had me at his home. He took me out to lunch. He shared his books with me, and the courses he was taking on Scientology and Dianetics with Ron Hubbard. And then we attended his Alcoholics Anonymous sessions together in prestigious hotel rooms in Guadalajara. Not to mention the places he took me to see in the area. He was truly a good uncle and friend, who, at least at that stage, allowed me a break from my routine life with my family. The fact was that, despite how much he thought highly of me, it wasn't possible for me to live permanently in his house. So I had to return to my old world, and resume my old responsibilities at home, school, and caring for my father. As for my eating habits, it would take me another 6 months to decide to try vegetarianism again. Soon I was already trying to begin reading the monumental work entitled The 36 Psychological Purposes by Drive de la Ferrier. At that time, it was in its first rough draft and very paperback edition. But what was interesting was that, in one of these first little books, the aforementioned doctor published a letter in which he named his first disciple, a Venezuelan named José Manuel Estrada Vázquez, as spiritual successor and general director of the GFU, Great Universal Fraternity, worldwide. And to my surprise, this man, Estrada, was still alive and in Mexico. But the good news was just beginning in my life, because astrology was taught at the GFU centers, and from time to time, the owners of the Airport Yoga Institute invited us and took us, free of charge, to the Kuautla ashram as visitors. It was there that I was able to see Master Estrada for the first time. He was an 80-year-old man with long, snow-white hair, white robes, a long, white cape, and sandals. He truly resembled a biblical Christ figure, only older. I immediately felt a powerful attraction to this figure. In the foolish way, I came to believe that many of those who were in this place had the character of Maestro Estrada. Over the years, I was to convince myself that there is no one like Estrada too. The Institute's owners, despite their human flaws, were so kind, and had so much faith in us, their students, that they would take us in their van to the ashrams in Cuautla or Cotepec, Veracruz, without charging us a single cent. It was a fraternal act that seemed natural to me at the time, but later, I would appreciate it. What is an ashram? It's a place where a master lives with his disciples and a meeting place for the Aquarian community. These are beings ready for a shift in their consciousness. Courtship, university and premonitory dreams of an unusual path. When I fell in love with that young woman my age who attended my yoga class, she seemed so special to me, that I even wanted to marry her. Naturally, like any inexperienced dreamer, I thought not of working toward marriage, but simply of getting married. Of course, it was crazy and not possible. In reality, the relationship didn't prosper, despite my always passionate temperament with women. Americo Living Trail 34. There were passionate, inexperienced caresses and kisses, but no sex at all. Especially because she wasn't really interested in my feelings and just played with them. This forced me to seek refuge in yoga practices, and I consulted with certain older women of the GFU, known as reverends. They were people who had been practicing yoga for about 10 or more years, and had spent roughly the same amount of time regularly attending schools of wisdom known as pre-initiatory and initiatory. I even confided in some of them about my emotional situation, and they honestly tried to guide me. Another man began to appear on the scene, rapidly projecting himself to become a guru, master, and spiritual successor, along with another more advanced disciple of Master Estrada. His name was Jose Marcelli. This man was to become my true master in the flesh. When I told this Master Marcelli a little about my girlfriend's horoscope, and then asked him what he thought, he said, "Brother, that person with so many planets in the 7th house, Aquarius and being a Scorpio, is not suitable for you." Here, astrology was a science as serious as a university degree is in the life of our society. This became a major choice at this point in my life. All of this happened in a very curious and definitive way. To begin with, I never had any money in my pocket at university, and like many students in Mexico, I was always hungry when I attended classes. But my case fell into the special situation experienced only by those students who aren't truly interested in a career for the money, thinking only about earning by the time they graduate, but who truly enjoy the profession as a mission in my life. So, in honor of this quest, this simply wasn't my place. This did not mean that I had essentially abandoned my studies, but rather that they had begun when I learned to read at around the age of 6. In any case, I already suspected that there was something different about me than the rest of the students, because in the days I entered the university I had already had some very illustrative dreams regarding who I am and why I was born. These were the kind of nights when I managed to separate my astral body from my physical body. Then one day I dreamed that I was at the university as a probationer, but that my destiny was to fight the demon woman, Lilith. Also around this time I had another very illustrative dream that referred to me as a prince who, during my process, had struggles with enemies of dark forces, and that I took refuge in the mud of lust, in order to survive, and hide from them. By this time, I'd already had premonitory dreams in high school. For example, what I dreamed one night happened exactly the same way the next day. Americo Living Trail 35. But beyond these supernatural dreams, as I've said, my enormous passion for women has never been quenched. It has been my torment and my glory, to the superlative degree, despite the simplicity of my life. It was during these university days that fate placed in my hands books like those of Blavatsky, the famous Russian woman who wrote The Secret Doctrine in the 19th century. Also the esoteric books of the well-known master known as the Tibetan Master of Blavatsky and Alice Bailey. And those of the famous Tibetan who transmigrated into the physical body of an Englishman, and was known as Lobsang Rampa. At that time, I was intensely reading everything from Friedrich Nietzsche to Helena Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled. I can't forget when a friend invited me to walk around the Faculty of Political Science, and stole the 2 volumes of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason from the library, and gave them to me. I studied them despite the complexity of their concepts. When I was still in philosophy school, I was bothered by the superficiality and haste of the curriculums. For example, they didn't finish studying Plato until they gave him up for dead, and they rushed to cram in their ideas, which they considered more modern, but they did so more or less arbitrarily, based on what they considered the truth. So between the insecurity that comes with the end of puberty and the extreme poverty I found myself in, where I sometimes didn't even have the money for transportation, it was easy for me to remain self-taught and a thinker. That's why I kept suspecting that behind all the history and the political and philosophical life of society, there really existed an internal world government. And that's why I sometimes wrote about these kinds of topics. I especially remember a series of notebooks I called Fundamental Politics. In them, I basically established that an institution always functions hierarchically, and that the division of social classes is an appearance. I called this division of classes or society, sociality, to distinguish it from what is simply social. Those little works, which I wrote hastily, in manuscript, filling about 4 notebooks, were left behind, and then lost in the hustle and bustle of my life. In my desire to make the message of the GFU and yoga felt within the university, I even went so far as to post a poster of Master de la Ferrier at the main entrance to the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities. This seemed like an insult to the university community, as they disappeared in less than 10 minutes, just like any esoteric or cultural mystical messages I left in public places, and on school blackboards. Incidentally, I can recall that, driven by my dreams of a social standing that I didn't have, I signed up with my student ID, to attend the university pool, which I can only visit once. Well, with leaving the university my destiny began to be written. Americo Living Trail 36. Inaugurating the World Headquarters House at the Airport Institute, a member of the GFU, Great Universal Fraternity. The owner of the house was my yoga instructor. She was a Capricorn woman, who was very particular about us arriving 10 minutes before the morning session began. Due to the instability of transport, I sometimes arrived 40 minutes early, which meant I was there before dawn, since the class started at 6:30. Approximately a year later, I was invited to attend the so-called Yamine School. Curiously, at that time, all members of the GFU in Mexico were summoned by Maestro Estrada to make a personal contribution to purchase the world headquarters located on Eugenia Street. That house was inaugurated with the first Yamine session, in which I was included. This seemed very symbolic to me, since the entire brotherhood worked to ensure that just a handful of us children would be the first to inaugurate the house. I remember that day, when I entered the hall that I considered sacred, I saw the photo of the Master of La Ferrier, and it seemed to me that we had known each other for centuries, and I said to him, "I'm here, Master." I was surprised that I didn't call him Master, Master of Masters, but rather, more familiarly, I simply called him Master. Around 40 Yamines entered this school. The deputy director was a woman I greatly admired who had recently received her Jesulas degree. She was very happy, and told us that we all looked like missionaries. Indeed, over time, all of these people began to occupy key positions within the GFU movement in Mexico, or they joined other spiritual movements around the world, as some went to foreign countries. Our first director would soon offer to teach us how to cast our horoscope, studying to be an astrologer and the mark of the chosen one. So these days I started attending the ashram in Cuautla or Cotepec, Veracruz, every 6 months. Americo Living Trail 37. The last day I attended the university as a student, I had to attend some classes, but at the same time I had an appointment with my Yamines instructor, to learn how to make my horoscope birth chart, and at that moment I decided to leave the university for good. It was around this year that I had a dream in which I saw the abominable snowman rising from the sea, and he showed me the earthquakes off Baja California. Then I saw myself off Venezuela in a great castle. I was locked within its thick walls, but because of my great faith its enormous gates opened, allowing me to see out to sea, and men in large canoes or boats came. When we reached the shore, they saw the mark on my forehead, and said I was chosen. So they showed me a red cloak and said, "Let us worship the mantle of Christ." This dream impressed me, especially because at that time, as a Yamine school, we went to greet Master Estrada at the Mexico City airport. He had made his only trip to Europe and Jerusalem in the Middle East. Shortly afterward, a fellow Yamine student, whose astrological sign is Cancer, told me that as Master Estrada was arriving at the reception, a tourist who had seen many people waiting for someone special stood by as a curious spectator. Then, when an elderly man dressed in white, in the style of the Templars, approached, he said in a mocking and sarcastic tone, "It's the abominable snowman." But I had dreamed precisely that the abominable snowman came out of the sea, so I understood that the abominable snowman is actually the original ancestor of the human race, and that he was represented by Master Estrada. Jose Marcelli received the guruship in Cuautla, and I was able to be there to witness the ceremony. By this time, Maestro Estrada was already looking tired, but especially on that day, his gaze and mine made a profound connection. It's a look I'll never forget, as if he were recognizing me as an equal. Master Estrada blessed me several times, touching the crown of my head with his hand, as is customary. And Master Marcelli had said that when this direct contact occurs from a master to a person, this act is the basis for a succession from master to disciple. Because the contact is direct, I began to make frank approaches to Maestro Marcelli, and he, at that time, was always patient. But the economic limitations in my life made me aware of the need to found businesses. I presented this to the Yamines group to which I belonged, trying to encourage us to create small businesses within the GFU. It was one of these days that a friend of mine from Yamines accompanied me to present my project to Maestro Marcelli. He was impressed, and yet his response was that he didn't want ants in the GFU, that the institution was only concerned with consciousness, not with a materialistic infrastructure. That was why the Templars had been persecuted in the Middle Ages, because they owned so much property. I left a little sad, but I obeyed what the master told me. Americo Living Trail 38. Maestro Marcelli had told me that my ideas were interesting anyway, so I should bring him more of them in writing. A fortnight later, I sent them to him. Naturally, he had a lot of matters to discuss, so through his wife, he forwarded my notes to my director at the school in Yamines. But Master Marcelli was one of the two most advanced disciples of Master Estrada, and the institution was already recognized in around 21 countries, so, rightly, or wrongly, many wanted to be Marcelli's disciples. This was the reason why, when Master Marcelli gave his order to the small group of Yamines, of which he was a part, there was both admiration and suspicion. So, of course, Master Marcelli's orders were not followed. But even then, I couldn't help but always feel happy at Yamines, despite the great economic insecurity that clouded my life, and it was only natural that I was happy at the GFU, because it was everything to my life, my university, my spiritual family, my destiny, in short, my everything. Well, except for every month end, when I was really rushed to cover my payment. It was on January 18th, Drivedy's birthday à la Ferrier, in 1980 or 1981, that I took the yoga postures and theory exam to advance to the second group of instructors. Everyone was amazed, because of the 8 candidates taking the exam that day, only I showed up and passed. Then, the instructor's husband, who was also a member of the GFU, said with profound sincerity to the other students, "Many of us are called, but few are chosen." One of these days, Master Estrada arrived from the airport, and stayed that night at the Airport Institute. When I arrived for yoga class, we went to see him. He welcomed us, and, while chatting, he looked out the window, saying, "You do yoga, you have a vegetarian diet, you bathe with natural water, etc. That's why you are the new race, everything out there is garbage." We asked for his blessing, and when it was my turn to prostrate myself before this master, I did so with all my devotion. It was the moment I most strongly felt that it was Christ who was blessing me. I can't forget that moment. Shortly after, Master Estrada passed away. Death of Master Estrada, and the oath to defend the Order of Aquarius. It was one night, when I received a call from a neighbor's house, and the daughter of my airport instructor told me that Maestro Estrada had just passed away. I had still seen him physically, when he inaugurated the Genie World headquarters. That day, while he was speaking about the Ark of Salvation, one of my companions told me, "Americo Living Trail 39. That Drive de la Ferrier was with Maestro Estrada, helping him give blessings to those in attendance." Only the doctor had La Ferrier been gone for 20 years. 3 days after this inauguration, in this very same place, I attended his final lecture, where the topic of his imminent death and the apostolic succession he would leave behind were discussed. All this stemmed from the fact that a sister who had dreamed of his death was present at that same lecture. Worried, she asked him if there would be a successor to the exalted position he held, first disciple of Master de la Ferrier. Master Estrada replied that we shouldn't worry, that there was a collegiate body, a governing group made up of reverends. However, the idea remained in the air that someone individually should be the successor, and, furthermore, Maestro Estrada himself did not really deny that possibility. I attended the wake for Maestro Estrada in the south of the city, at one of the ISSSTE wakes. His only son and his wife Carlota were serene and smiling, which filled me with admiration. But even more special would be what he would experience the next day. Many of us from the GFU arrived at the wakes, and I excitedly sought out my instructor from the Airport Institute, so I could go with her to the maestro's burial. But with her usual sternness, she told me I had to be with Yamine's group. Everyone, in general, was dressed in white, and as I searched for my group of Yamines, I found myself advancing toward where Maestro Estrada's coffin lay. I climbed the stairs, and entered this place. There was someone guarding the door, but I learned this later. That guard must have been in worse shape than I was, because he didn't say anything to me when I passed into that large room. A kind of wire fence stood between us, but we were all participating in a solemn act, to the point of severity, at least that's how it seemed to me. They made us raise our hands, in the style of the German army during Hitler's time, and then the one leading the oath said, "We swear to defend the order, in the name of the sacred initiatic tradition," etc. I was impressed, because it was my higher self who had surely led me here and acted. After the ceremony, I descended like a true lord. I felt so focused and special because the moment I took the oath, I truly became an adult. Finally I found my group, and in the corresponding truck we were transported to the pantheon called the Garden of Memories. A huge stone Christ seemed to be waiting for us in the middle of the cemetery. Hundreds of people dressed in white were making their way to the place where Maestro Estrada would be buried, just to the right of the great stone Christ. This reminded me of the saying, "He will be at the right hand of the Heavenly Father," and also that Peter of the New Age is the cornerstone of the new church. Americo Living Trail 40. During the burial ceremony, we began singing the Ode to Joy, using a piece of paper that had been given to us. It was a very emotional moment. A few days later I was writing, and a higher energy took control of my hand and I scribbled, "Ask Guru Marcelli or Reverend Carlota for everything related to GFU affiliated and internal businesses." I went and mentioned it to Maestro Marcelli, and he said it was possible. But he didn't give me anything related to it. I was also impressed when I underlined, "Take up your cross and follow me." The Saturday following Maestro Estrada's death, when we attended school in Yamines and closed the session, it is customary to ask the Bible for a message. That afternoon, the part of the Gospel appeared where Jesus Christ says, "Go throughout the world blessing everyone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." This wouldn't have been so important, if it hadn't been for the fact that Master Estrada had passed away less than a week earlier, and we were all in shock. So the message was clear: we should become apostles of the Order of Aquarius founded by Master de la Ferrier and his first disciple, Estrada. In a record time of no more than a month, a group of brothers worked hard to publish a book containing the most important communications that Master Estrada had given throughout his life as a real initiate. The book was entitled My Announcements. Also immediately after Master Estrada had passed away, the hierarchy of the GFU solar line founded by Master Estrada in 21 countries, was so inspired, that they made an effort to reach Mexico. Everyone generally knew that the Master's main desire was to establish a collegiate body composed of reverends from all the countries, where the institution was established. It was a kind of world initiatory government, to guide the spiritual destiny of the world. Within about 2 weeks, reverends from all these countries met at the world headquarters, and in a truly fraternal and spiritual manner, with Master Marcelli in attendance, the reverends established the collegiate body. They enthusiastically recounted how they had overcome the difficulties to make it to the meeting in Mexico. Many of us were truly confident that this collegiate body would function properly, maintaining its global outlook, so that La GF.U would occupy a rightful place on the Americo Living Trail 41 planet. But it was all a result of the inspiration brought about by the passing of Maestro Estrada, and soon that assembly would be merely a decoration for the institution. There was still a little over a year left before I joined the woman who would become the mother of my 4 children, and that year was one of the important changes for me, as I matured, and became disillusioned with everything that had begun to happen within this fraternity. My financial situation wasn't improving, but thousands of young brothers, like me, had also been orphaned, by risking our destiny with the GFU solar line. We were left in the hands of a hierarchy that was rather weak in ambition, and the most dangerous thing of all was that this hierarchy was rapidly tending toward the strange bureaucracy. At that time, Master Marcelli's teachings seemed clear in every aspect, although he basically preached that all disciples aspiring to become gurus should first enjoy money, stimulate and grow with this ambition, so that by the time they became gurus, they would already have mastered this experience. But, like many of the other brothers without hierarchy, I wondered, what happens if a person has already been a millionaire in several lifetimes, and now money doesn't trigger a fundamental emotion in him, enough to experience it as a simple, ambitious human being, but rather in a truly spiritual, philosophical context? How should such brothers behave? Family situation. At that time my father returned to his sad streak of getting sick every year or year and a half, and was detained in the hospital. It was times like these when the most capable members of the family had to take on the usual responsibilities that fell to my father. When he returned from the hospital, he generally failed to act maturely, and became jealous of his own little world, so he would resume his parental responsibilities in a haphazard manner. His behavior could be so uncontrollable that he would momentarily leave us without jobs. He wasn't a bad person, but he sometimes acted immaturely. This was a never-ending story in his beloved little workshop, and under those conditions, no economic advancement was possible. Overall, my father was a very loving person, but he was passionate and poorly educated. I've already talked enough about my father and my childhood. But to clarify my family situation and my approach to the GFU, I'll elaborate a little more on the subject. When my father was hospitalized, small commitments had to be met, so I was sometimes forced to steal some insignificant but valuable material from the hardware store by tipping the employees, or by changing something on the receipt used to pick up the merchandise. These were rare, but stealing was not a pleasant task. Americo Living Trail 42. Other times, with or without my father, some of my siblings or relatives would accompany me to work in restaurants installing air conditioning in their kitchens. We would even arrive to work at midnight or early in the morning. However, I was happy by nature, which is why I always valued pleasant experiences more than unpleasant ones. For example, when I started becoming a vegetarian, my father liked to invite me every weekend to the old Hidalgo market in the working-class neighborhood, so I could eat a giant fruit cocktail. In return, when he wanted a tool that would make our work easier, I would do my part to help him acquire it. It was actually cheap, but given our financial situation, it sometimes seemed impossible. So, the day he wanted a color TV, and then a home movie video, I told him we would have it, and so we did. Details like this went unnoticed by my family, who had grown so accustomed to me, that they acted as if all this were my duty and I were a second dad or emerging dad. But when the extremes of family contempt sank deep into me, my emotions spiraled into crisis. Furthermore, in the long run, this whole environment and this general situation in my life was going to push me to make crucial decisions, and it seemed that the final straw, a total failure in my entire existence, would be unleashed with the relationship in which I would have 4 children. Throughout my adolescence, and into my youth, I often walked down the street carrying some kind of metal artifact, usually a sheet of metal that had to be taken to be machined. And one day, I realized that this had to end. Because it became clear to me that I, like millions of others around the world, was trapped in a misery from which there was no escape. But it wasn't good to be condemned for eternity to the same way of life in which, humanly speaking, nothing could be done. And my solution wasn't to renounce the spiritual, to pursue a professional career. Even though I was already in my youth and still living from day to day. And with the death of Maestro Estrada and the institutionalization of consciousness in the GFU, I could no longer have great hopes for my fulfillment according to my nature. Waiter at the world headquarters and wholemeal bread seller. It was in the midst of poverty that the administrators of the world headquarters offered me a paltry salary to do the general cleaning of the entire building. I was extremely excited. Maestro Estrada hadn't passed away long, and being able to sweep and mop the floors there was all I had left in my spiritual aspirations. This opportunity to work almost without pay was an honor. I managed to cope with my ailing father, and was always euphoric, positively out of control, with my friends at the world headquarters. Americo Living Trail 43. But I received no special recognition, rather, I was treated as what I officially was, a simple unremarkable young man. I realized that even one of the administrators, with homosexual tendencies, aspired to be an initiate, and I didn't exist. I vividly remember one afternoon, when this effeminate brother called me at the headquarters and asked me, "Have you finished mopping and sweeping the upstairs and downstairs floors?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "Because you have to prepare the conference room in 1 hour maximum." I tried to explain to him the impossibility of this, but that was not his problem. These are things that happen in most companies, but in an institution like this, something different is expected. However, as in religious temples, individuals are often worse, perhaps precisely because when once normal people, many became fanatics of Master Estrada, seeing him as a god, and not studying his teachings, but instead taking some small phrases literally, turning them into dogmas of life or to exert power over others. One afternoon, as a waiter at the headquarters, I was very hungry, as I usually only had enough coins to get back home. It was the time when the naturopathic doctor, Reverend Chea Mitchin, was gaining recognition at the GFU, because he managed to cure cases that official medicine declared incurable. Reverend Chea continued to be very philanthropic, from the time he gave Master Estrada the land, to found the Kotapek Ashram. During those days, when I was working at the headquarters, I had donated many boxes of mangoes to the GFU. All of those boxes were stored in the room below, and the managers couldn't agree on what to do with the merchandise. It was one afternoon, when I was hungry, that I decided to enter the warehouse. Since it was closed, I jumped through the window, which barely fit me, and once inside, I filled a large bag with mangoes. It was a small thing, since there were many boxes in such a large room. I ate several of these sweet fruits, and took the rest home. I attended my amines classes with great enthusiasm, and there were people who had been practicing yoga and vegetarianism for many years, and they seemed different from the rest of the crowd. But also, as they acquired a greater cross, this was the recognition gradually given to those who climb the hierarchy. Most of them became more spiritually ambitious in a distorted way. That is, they wanted to be missionaries so that, whether they knew it or not, they could become New Age bureaucrats. Americo Living Trail 44. Hearts that I had initially seen blossom with humility and a true desire to serve humanity became more serious and inaccessible as they dressed in white, and wore the cross they wore at chest height. They sought to become disciples of the current gurus, and, consequently, joined the cliques, as if they were a political party, and not a college of wisdom. This became inevitable. Knowledge ceased to be something original for the aspirants, and began to become a result of unconditional compliance with the statutes of the institution's council and the literal teachings of Master Estrada. One afternoon he would experience his unilateral attitudes firsthand. I was trying to sell some homemade bread, that I made using an oven I built myself, and using my father's tools. So, I would arrive a little early to my pre-initiation school session and open my 2 or 3 boxes of whole wheat bread. Then my friends would come over and buy it, with the double joy of selling it at a good price, and also helping me financially. With this, I earned a little money, which I always urgently needed, even to pay the monthly fees imposed by the school. I also tried to sell them some homemade vegetarian coffee, also made at home. But soon after, one of these people, whom I had seen as warm-hearted years ago, who gradually hardened, summoned me. He was the council's spokesperson at World Headquarters, and he said to me, "Brother, we can't allow you to continue selling your products here. If we did, this would eventually become a market. The facility would become dirty, and that can't be right." As I presented him with some points of view, why it was necessary for the institution to support commercial and monetary growth for the benefit of some of its members, he promised to consider the matter. "Let's see how you can sell your products 1 day a week, but in an orderly manner." Of course, he never did this, nor was he seriously interested. I reluctantly agreed, regretting that my brother couldn't understand what hunger was. This was probably the case, since this particular brother had a government job, and could therefore hope with great objectivity to eventually sell homemade products as a hobby. But my situation was desperate, as it always was, when money was involved. So I realized how far some people were from truly understanding what the hunger of humanity is. It saddened me to know that even my own Maestro Marcelli didn't understand it. And yet he has vows like not to touch money. However, the social class divide remained in place within the institution, as in any business in the world, as some, whether gurus or simple students of the place, managed to achieve some security with food, although officially they did not touch money. Americo Living Trail 45. But given the circumstances, I considered myself lucky, as I would much rather be in my situation than live dreaming of becoming a half-initiate. Failed in Yamines. Around the time Maestro Estrada passed away, I had a friend who became very close to me, and I spent a lot of time with her at school in Yamines. She married early, and invited me to her house for lunch. Those were pleasant weekends, because her husband loved me too. It was the day of the week when I ate well and in abundance. But at school, there was jealousy about almost everything, in my case, because I was too childish and emotional. As they say, no one gave a damn about me. Naturally, we all generally assumed we were gurus, and the women aspired to have her husband like the school principal. This is generally what I perceived, and what I was able to confirm, when the day approached, after a year and a half of being at Yamines school, when we would be promoted to the next initiation school level, Geniana Medium School, and it was announced that I wouldn't be moving on to the Jagnian Medium School. No one explained to me why. I was very confused, because I thought I had done things well, and I was recommended by Maestro Marcelli to study my ideas at school. I wanted to attribute this decision to the fact that, a few months earlier, I had revealed myself to my instructor at the Airport Institute, the owner of that place. Truly trying to follow Maestro Estrada and his guidelines, she sent a letter accusing me of deserting the Airport Institute. In reality, I had wanted to leave to avoid friction with her, and wanted to transfer to the institute at the world headquarters, but she refused to release the people she had trained and promoted to the Yamines school. In fact, like most of us who had grown to love the GFU, my reactions were very emotional and somewhat passionate. The director of Yamines ordered me to return to the Airport Institute. I stood up, and said to him, Master Estrada has said, that only the military obey blindly, but that we are not military but conscious beings, and my conscience tells me, that I should be somewhere else. I think what I said, didn't please the director, because he started to change color, first pale and then red. He got furious, and in a loud voice he forbade me from questioning his orders. I sat down reluctantly, confused and annoyed. My friend looked at me deeply, and continued with the scolding. Americo Living Trail 46. You're looking really bad. The best thing for you to do, is go and apologize to the principal. I listened attentively, because I knew she really cared for me, and I accepted her suggestion. I went to the principal and apologized, assuring him I would return to the Airport Institute. He was pleased and thanked me. So, on orders from the Yamines principal, I had to return to the Airport Institute. But contrary to expectations, when I arrived, and was about to start my yoga session, my instructor said I couldn't stay. My response was, that she had orders from the management of my school in Yamines. She sent another letter, and said she didn't want people who didn't want to be at her school. The principal called me out again, and asked me not to cause any more trouble. Now he was begging me not to return to that place, so I said, but you ordered me to go. So I think I should stay. He didn't know what to say anymore and just continued with his work. The time they handed out the half-Jagnian crosses, I decided to attend as a measure of humility for myself, knowing that in 6 months I would be with them at the same half-Jagnian school. The brothers received the cross from the hands of Maestro Marcelli. I soon learned that I was actually being accused of being the lover of my newlywed friend, and that we were both cheating on her husband. Just gossip. I had to clear this up with the principal immediately. I looked for him, and when I found him, I assured him that the claim that he was in love with my friend wasn't true. He apologized and simply added that he was very sorry, because he had been misinformed. This seemed to me like the reaction of some police authorities who, after having a defendant in jail and his innocence being discovered, simply politely apologize and release him. Because, in my opinion, having to answer to a school, pay monthly fees, cooperate in organizing events, bring a vegetarian meal out of our own pocket etc., was already enough. But I wasn't prepared for any other option, so I had to wait 6 more months before moving to the middle of Jegnian, the half-Jegnian cross. Shortly after, my father, who was deaf in one ear, was run over by a truck and broke the long bone in his leg for the second time. An ambulance arrived and rushed him to a hospital. He was in the hospital suffering terrible pain due to the negligence or overwork of the unpaid staff. While this was happening, I had to go to Kuala to receive my half-Jegnian cross. Americo Living Trail 47. By then, my friend from Yamines was getting into trouble with her husband, because she was frigid and her husband was very passionate. So one day they decided to separate, leaving her with a daughter of a few months, the fruit of that marriage. This was very hard for my friend, who decided to get away for a while. Law Institución. I would see her again after a few years, when I was at the Jegnian school, and I was trying to join the institution. Ives, a schoolmate, was trying to form a pilot group for the movement he called AUDIOS, an Oriental word that translates as seaman, and which referred to a movement for young Aquarians. Once, Maestro Marcelli gave a talk to the AUDIOS youth, and I asked him many questions about sexuality, until I asked him directly about the right sexual positions. He answered firmly, "This is something that the master teaches his disciple from what he has heard." I wish he had spoken to us young Aquarians more frankly and directly about sexuality. A special friend. During my time at Jegnian Middle School, I met a very special friend who saw me as a teacher, although we treated each other as friends. Something like this has always happened in my life, until now. I mean that a companion appears on my path trying to understand my teachings. This happened with this friend, and between conversations, we touched on various topics. He, who wasn't bad looking, confessed to me that he worked in special places giving massages to women. I could imagine the rest. Sometimes he told me that he had recently taken a student from Eugenia's Yoga Institute to a rented bathhouse, but it had all been just sex. However, this fellow had spiritual concerns, although he didn't quite dare to dive in. He listened attentively when I spoke to him about the global value of the GFU institution. His genuine interest pleased me. Once, we went together to the Kotapak ashram, and on the way, he told me he'd had dreams in which he was told he had two paths, one of which was tempted by the forces of Americo Living Trail 48, evil, and the other by Jesus Christ. He also told me that he had a friend who one day took him to his house and invoked a host of demons, and through this friend, the demons began to speak in a diabolical manner. During our stay at the Kotapak ashram, Reverend Carlota, Estrada's widow, was there. She was particularly struck by my friend's presence, and invited him to accompany her to her house, located within the ashram itself, near the Reverend's chamber. When my friend returned from this visit, he was very moved, and told me that Reverend Carlota had shown him the wooden cross that Master de la Ferrier used when he was in Venezuela. She explained to him that this cross was lent to all those who received higher degrees. They wore it for a few moments to charge themselves with the Master's vibration. Small retreat. With a basic study of astrology, I was able to review my transits in my horoscope birth chart, and once I discovered that a certain astrological aspect with Uranus would cause me to temporarily withdraw into Law Institución, a kind of retirement, motivated by responsibilities to my family and my father's illness. But once this was over, I could return to live another stage within La Institución. I mentioned this to my friend, and told him that after the Day of the Dead celebrations, it was always a time of painful changes in my life. I would be leaving the institution. He was surprised and fascinated by my prediction, because at that time everything seemed to be going more or less well in my life, but as a few months passed, he was able to see that I was right. I attended the Day of the Dead party, but I was alone. There was no contact with my group. Something was showing me that I was no longer in my place. In reality, I studied many things on my own, in silence. It was the last time I was with them, and I had done everything possible for my school, and the result was my own dissatisfaction, because I tried to form groups, so we could do some business and work with society. But I saw that our instructors at the school followed Master Estrada's teachings literally. I thought that Maestro Estrada himself was surely still evolving, and that he was no longer the same as when he passed away. Then, even the instructors who led us did not fully comply with their disciplines, being more concerned with taking advantage of a kind of pitched battle to rise in the hierarchy, even disrespecting the authority of Guru Marcelli. But Master Marcelli also had his own unique way of understanding the path, and I wasn't able to accept all of his teachings. For example, one afternoon I attended one of his lectures, and the master said, Americo Living Trail 49. If someone of the caliber of the sublime senior brother, Estrada, were to appear, we would not wait for him to go through all the degrees of initiation, we would put him to work immediately. It was a promise I couldn't keep, as I later